Story number 1. Apartment 14C. I moved to Seoul for work. A 3-year contract with a publishing company that promised good pay and a chance to reinvent myself. Finding an apartment was a nightmare. The city was crowded, and housing came at a premium. When I found a place under budget in a modern building near the subway, I jumped at the chance. 14C, the leasing agent had said, her voice dropping slightly. She hesitated, the pen hovering over the contract. It's available. But what? I asked. I didn't have the energy for a long explanation. I needed a place, and I needed it now. She glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. The previous tenants, they didn't stay long. Some said they had strange experiences. I laughed it off. I wasn't superstitious, and strange experiences were part of life in a foreign country. Weren't they? I signed the lease without a second thought. The building was sleek and modern, with polished floors and soft lighting that made it feel more like a hotel than a residential tower. The elevator was quick, and the hallway leading to my apartment was spotless. When I unlocked the door to 14C, I was greeted by a clean, open space with large windows overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, the skyline glittering in the distance. But the air inside the apartment felt wrong. It wasn't something I could explain. It was as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting. I chalked it up to jet lag and stress from the move. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, set up my workspace, and got into the rhythm of my new job. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint creaks and whispers, sounds I told myself were just the building settling. Once, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping past the bedroom door, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. Then the dreams started. In the first one, I was standing in the middle of the apartment, the lights flickering overhead. The air was thick, heavy, and I couldn't move. Across the room stood a woman, her back to me. She wore a long, white dress that clung to her frame like wet paper. Her hair was black and tangled, hanging in thick ropes that obscured her face. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel her watching me, her gaze burning through the veil of her hair. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The dreams became more frequent, more vivid. The woman began to appear closer, her presence heavier, suffocating. I'd wake up gasping for air, her image seared into my mind. She never spoke, but I felt her intent. She wasn't just watching me, she was waiting for me. I started noticing strange things around the apartment. The temperature would drop suddenly, the air turning icy even though it was summer. Lights flickered, and the television turned on by itself more than once, always to static. The worst was the smell, faint at first, like mildew, but it grew stronger, a sickly, cloying stench that seemed to come from the walls. One night, I found myself standing in the middle of the living room without remembering how I'd gotten there. The windows were wide open, the curtains billowing in the night air. I never left the windows open. By the second month, I was barely sleeping. I began researching the history of the apartment, desperate for answers. What I found only deepened my unease. Over the past 10 years, 5 tenants had lived in 14C. All of them had either left abruptly or died. 3 suicides, 2 accidents. No connection between the victims. No clear explanation. Just a string of tragedies that the building management seemed eager to cover up. I contacted the leasing agent. She sounded uncomfortable, evasive, but I pressed her until she admitted the rumors. They say it's cursed, she whispered. The woman in white, people have seen her, felt her, but it's just a story, right? I wasn't so sure anymore. The final straw came one night when I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic scrape like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the bedroom closet. My heart pounded as I crept toward the sound, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. The closet door creaked as I opened it. revealing nothing but darkness and the faint smell of rot. I stared into the void, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then I saw it, a single, pale hand reaching out from the shadows, the fingers long and impossibly thin. I slammed the door shut and ran. I spent the next few nights at a hotel. But the dreams followed me. The woman in white was no longer confined to 14C. She appeared in every shadow, every reflection. I couldn't escape her. I returned to the apartment out of desperation, hoping to confront whatever it was, to end the nightmare. The moment I stepped inside, the air seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. I turned on every light in the apartment, but the shadows seemed to grow darker, deeper. I stood in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting. She came at midnight. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I could hear her, the soft rustle of her dress, the whisper of her breath. And then she was there, standing just a few feet away, her hair hanging like a curtain over her face. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling, her head tilted, her movements slow, deliberate. And then she spoke, her voice a low, guttural rasp that chilled me to the core. "You took my place." I don't remember much after that, just the overwhelming sense of cold, the sound of my own screams, and her face pale, empty, her eyes black pits that seemed to stretch into eternity. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The apartment remains empty, its windows dark and lifeless. Sometimes, I think I see her standing there, watching me from the 14th floor, waiting, and I know that one day, she'll find me again. Story number 2. The chair. I first heard about the chair during a backpacking trip through Europe. It was my third night in Italy, and I was staying in a small village tucked away in the hills of Tuscany, the kind of place with cobblestone streets, crumbling stone buildings, and an eerie quiet that settled over everything after dark. The locals directed me to a bar Il Vizio. They called it the Vice. It was a dark, smoky place with low wooden beams and a bartender who poured wine without asking questions. I sat at the counter, nursing a glass of something bitter, when I overheard the conversation. "You don't believe in the curse?" a man with a thick accent was saying, his voice low and urgent. His companion, younger and louder, laughed. "It's just a chair. Superstitions for old men." I couldn't help myself. "What chair?" I asked, leaning over. The older man's eyes flicked to me, and his face tightened. He muttered something in Italian, shook his head, and turned back to his drink. But the younger one grinned. "The sedia maledetta," he said. "The cursed chair. It's in the back room." He gestured toward a doorway shrouded in shadows. The bartender slammed a glass onto the counter. "Enough," he barked in English, glaring at both of us. "No talk about the chair. That should have been the end of it. I should have taken the hint, paid my tab, and left. But curiosity is a funny thing, isn't it?" That night, as the bar emptied out and the lights dimmed, I found myself lingering, waiting for a chance to slip into the back room unnoticed. When it came, I took it. The room was small, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of damp wood hung heavy. In the center of the room sat the chair. It was unremarkable at first glance, a simple wooden thing, its varnish worn down to a dull sheen. But there was something about it, something that made my chest tighten and my breath catch. Felt like the chair was watching me. I stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath my boots. My fingers itched to touch it, to run over the grooves and scratches that marred the wood. I could almost hear the whispers of those who had sat in it before me, daring fate, challenging the curse. "It's not real," I muttered to myself, my voice trembling. "It's just a chair." But my hand stopped inches from the armrest. Something, instinct, maybe, or fear held me back. I turned and left the room, the door creaking shut behind me. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that it was better not to tempt fate. And then I saw him, He was sitting at the bar. The younger man from earlier. His face was pale, and he was sweating despite the chill in the room. I slid onto the stool next to him. "Are you okay?" His eyes darted to mine, wide and filled with something close to panic. "I sat in it," he whispered. "After you left. Just for a second. It's nothing, right? Just a stupid story." I didn't know what to say. His hands were shaking, and his drink sat untouched in front of him. "You'll be fine," I said, though I didn't believe it. "It's just a chair." He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "You don't understand." They all said the same thing. Just a chair. And then they died. I left soon after, my unease growing with every step I took back to the hostel. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, his pale face, the way his hands trembled. The chair was just a chair, wasn't it? I stayed in the village for another 2 days. On the third, the young man was found dead. The police called it an accident. He'd fallen from the second-story balcony of his apartment, his neck snapping on impact. But the locals whispered of the chair. "It's always the same," one woman told me, crossing herself. "They sit in it, and within a week, they're gone." I wanted to forget. I wanted to leave the village and never think about the cursed chair again. But something about it stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I needed to know more. Back in the US, I started digging. The chair had a long and bloody history, stretching back centuries. The bar had once been a farmhouse, owned by a man named Domenico Lupo. According to legend, Lupo was a cruel and violent man who terrorized the village. When he was finally killed, stabbed to death in a brawl, he cursed the chair with his dying breath. "Let my seat bring death to all who dare to sit upon it," he had said. Or so the story went. Over the years, the chair had claimed dozens of victims. A farmer who dared sit in it to mock the curse was trampled by his own oxen. A traveling merchant fell ill and died within days of resting in the chair. Even during the war, a German soldier who sat in it was killed by an unexploded mine. The bar's owner had tried to get rid of it, but the chair always found its way back. A year later, I returned to the village. The bar was still there, though it seemed quieter now, the locals more wary. I asked about the chair, but the bartender refused to speak of it. "It's gone," he said curtly. "Locked away where it can't hurt anyone." But I wasn't satisfied. I needed to see it again, to face it. I found it in a museum in Florence, displayed behind a rope barrier with a sign that read, "Do not touch." The room was crowded, tourists snapping photos and murmuring to each other. I stood at the edge of the barrier, staring at the chair. It looked smaller than I remembered, less menacing, but the air around it felt heavy, charged. I could almost hear the whispers again, faint and teasing. One man, a burly American in a baseball cap, leaned over the barrier to get a closer look. The guard yelled at him, but he just laughed, brushing his hand against the backrest. I left before I could see what happened next. I didn't need to. I already knew. The curse of the chair lives on, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of it. I see it sitting there, in that dark room, its wood gleaming faintly in the flickering light, and I hear a voice, soft and mocking, calling me back. "Sit." Story number 3. The Room Beneath. We moved into the house in North London just after my job transferred me. It was a Victorian row house with chipped paint, narrow hallways, and creaky wooden floors. Alice, my wife, loved the place immediately. "It has charm," she said, running her hand along the ornate banister. I wasn't so sure. The house was old, and old houses have secrets. But we had 2 kids, a budget, and very few options in this city. The first time I heard the noise, it was late at night. Alice and the kids were asleep upstairs. I'd stayed up to watch a football match. The television's glow the only light in the living room. Somewhere beneath me, in the bowels of the house, came a faint scraping sound. like metal dragging on stone. It lasted for only a few seconds, but it was enough to send a shiver crawling up my spine. I muted the TV and sat still, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was nothing. Houses like this always creak and groan in the night, but that noise didn't sound like the usual settling of an old home. It was deliberate, alive. The next morning, I mentioned it to Alice. She laughed it off. "Rats," she said. "Or maybe foxes outside." Her tone was dismissive, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The noises didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, I heard them almost every night. Faint scratching, the occasional knock, and once, what sounded like a low, guttural sigh. Alice heard it too, though she refused to acknowledge it. "It's an old house, Henry," she'd say, as though that explained everything. The kids didn't seem to notice, but I started catching Emily, our youngest, staring at the basement door with a peculiar intensity. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and said, "Nothing." One evening, the water pressure in the kitchen dropped to a pathetic dribble. Alice insisted I call a plumber. He arrived the next morning, a wiry man with a cigarette tucked behind his ear. After inspecting the sink, he announced that he'd need to check the main line in the basement. The basement was more of a cellar, really a dank, narrow space with a low ceiling and walls made of crumbling brick. I rarely went down there. It smelled of mildew and damp earth, and the single bulb overhead cast more shadows than light. The plumber descended the stairs with a grunt, muttering something about ancient pipes. I hovered near the doorway, not wanting to be alone in that cold, oppressive space. After a few minutes, he called me down. "You've got a strange setup here," he said, pointing to a section of wall near the back of the cellar. "There's a hollow space behind here. Might be an old coal storage or something. Want me to open it up?" I hesitated. Something about the idea made my skin crawl, but curiosity won out. "Go ahead," I said. The plumber fetched a sledgehammer from his van and began chipping away at the plaster. Each strike echoed through the basement, the sound harsh and jarring. After a few minutes, a hole appeared in the wall, revealing a dark, narrow room beyond. The smell hit us first, damp, musty, with a faint metallic tang. I shone my phone's flashlight into the opening and felt a chill run down my spine. The room was no bigger than a closet, its walls lined with flaking plaster. In the center was a rusted metal cot, its mattress yellowed with age. A small table sat in the corner, littered with scraps of paper and what looked like an old tin cup. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the room itself were holding its breath. "Bloody hell," the plumber muttered. "Looks like someone's been living down here." The thought made my stomach turn. How could someone have stayed down here without us knowing? And for how long? I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the windows made my heart race. Alice tried to reassure me, but I could tell she was rattled too. "It's probably just an old storage room," she said. "Nothing to worry about." But I was worried, more than I wanted to admit. The noises grew louder after that. Scraping turned into knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone or something were trying to get out. Emily started having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming about the man in the basement. Ben, our eldest, refused to go downstairs alone, claiming he felt like someone was watching him. One night, I woke to find the basement door ajar. I was certain I'd locked it before bed. The darkness beyond seemed to pulse, alive with an energy I couldn't explain. I closed the door and locked it again, my hands trembling. A week later, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and coming from the basement stairs. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the noise, my heart hammering in my chest. The basement door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. I stepped inside, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The footsteps stopped. I shone the flashlight down the stairs and saw nothing, but the air was different, thick, suffocating, and filled with the unmistakable scent of decay. I took a step back, my pulse racing. And that's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, coming from the darkness below. Leave. The voice was barely audible, but it was enough to send me scrambling back upstairs. I slammed the door shut and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We moved out 2 weeks later. I didn't tell the new owners about the noises or the hidden room. Part of me felt guilty, but another part was just relieved to be free of that place. Still, I can't shake the memories. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing in the distance, and I wonder if the man in the basement has found another home. Story number 4. The 100 Candles. It was a humid October night, the kind where the air sticks to your skin like a damp sheet. When Takumi brought the idea to the table, "Have you ever heard of the Hyakimonogatari Kaidankai?" he asked, his voice low, conspiratorial. The 5 of us, me, Takumi, Yuki, Rika, and Daichi, were crammed into the back corner of the old gymnasium, our usual hangout after school hours. The lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting flickering shadows across the cracked wooden floors. I shook my head. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. "It's a ritual," Takumi continued, his dark eyes glittering. "You light 100 candles, tell a ghost story for each one, and blow out the flame after each story. They say that when the last candle goes out, something crosses over." Rika scoffed. "You're not serious." "Why not?" Takumi grinned. "It's just a game. A little fun to celebrate the end of exams." "Fun," Daichi muttered, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, because summoning spirits is my idea of a great time." Despite our protests, Takumi convinced us. Maybe it was the way he spun the story, weaving just enough mystery into the details to make it irresistible. Or maybe it was boredom. The school was stifling during the day, the kind of place where the walls seemed to press in on you. But at night it transformed. The hallways stretched endlessly into darkness, the silence broken only by the occasional creak or whisper of the wind. It was the perfect setting for something like this. The following Friday, we met in classroom 3C after the janitor locked up. Takumi had brought a bag of tea light candles, a box of matches, and a book of ghost stories he'd borrowed from the library. We arranged the candles in a wide circle on the floor, the flames flickering uneasily as we lit them one by one. The room was bathed in a soft, golden glow, the shadows on the walls stretching and shifting like restless phantoms. Takumi went first, telling a story about a cursed well in his grandmother's village. His voice was steady, confident, but there was an edge to it, a nervous energy that made my skin prickle. When he finished, he leaned forward and blew out a candle. The room seemed darker somehow, even though there were still 99 flames left. We took turns, each story darker than the last. Daichi recounted an urban legend about a faceless woman who followed people home at night. Rika told a tale of a cursed doll that moved on its own. By the time it was my turn, the air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. I stumbled through a story about a haunted forest, my voice trembling despite myself. Around the 50th candle, Yuki stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on the doorway. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" I asked, my throat tight. "There was something," she said, her voice barely audible. "In the hallway." Takumi snorted. "Don't let your imagination get to you." But I'd seen it too, a flicker of movement, just at the edge of the candlelight, like a shadow, but darker, thicker, as though the air itself had folded in on itself. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. We pressed on, the stories growing more frantic, more desperate. The candles burned lower, their flames guttering as though struggling to stay alive. The room felt colder now, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones. When we reached the 99th candle, Takumi hesitated. His bravado had cracked, his hands trembling as he held the matchbook. "Maybe we should stop," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. You're the one who wanted to do this. Rika snapped. Are you chickening out now? He shook his head, forcing a grin. No way. He lit the final candle and leaned back, his face pale in the flickering light. For a moment, none of us spoke. The room was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak, every breath. Then we heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely more than a rustle of air, but it grew louder, more distinct. The words were unintelligible, a guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Yuki gasped, clutching my arm. It's behind us, she said, her voice trembling. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw it. A figure stood in the shadows just beyond the circle of light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs stretched to unnatural lengths. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling void, blacker than the darkest corner of the room. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. Blow it out, Daichi hissed. Blow out the last candle. Takumi scrambled forward, his hands shaking as he reached for the flame. The whispering grew louder, angrier, the air around us vibrating with an unnatural energy. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the figure to lurch forward. The candle went out. For a moment, everything was still. Then the screams started. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I remember running, the hallway stretching endlessly before me. I remember the sound of footsteps, heavy and relentless, echoing behind us. I remember Yuki's hand slipping from mine, her scream cutting off abruptly as she was pulled into the shadows. We never spoke about that night. Yuki's parents reported her missing the next day, but the police found no trace of her. A week later, Daichi was killed in a car accident on his way to school. They said he must have fallen asleep at the wheel. But I knew better. Takumi stopped coming to school altogether, his parents claiming he'd moved to another city. Though I never believed them, the whispers still haunt me. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear them soft and insistent, just beyond the edge of hearing. Sometimes, I think I see the figure, standing at the foot of my bed, his void-like face watching me, waiting. I haven't lit a candle since. Story number 5. The House on Ocean Avenue. When I bought the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, I knew exactly what I was getting into. The price was absurdly low for a 3-story Dutch colonial, and the real estate agent wore a smile that barely masked her unease. A lot of history here, she said, handing me the keys with a flourish. It's a great deal for the right buyer. She didn't need to elaborate. Everyone in Amityville knew the history. Ronald DeFeo Jr. had slaughtered his entire family here in 1974. 6 people, 2 parents and 4 kids, shot dead in their beds. He claimed voices told him to do it. The house had sat empty for years after the Lutz family moved out, claiming it was haunted by something dark, something malevolent. I didn't believe in ghosts. What I did believe in was a fresh start, and this house was my shot at it. The first night was uneventful. The house felt old, smelled faintly of dust and mildew, but it was quiet, peaceful, even. I unrolled a sleeping bag in the living room and settled in, too tired to worry about unpacking. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a faint creaking sound, like someone was walking upstairs. My heart thudded in my chest as I listened. The house was empty, wasn't it? I grabbed my flashlight and crept up the stairs, every step groaning under my weight. At the top, the air was colder, though all the windows were closed. The noise had stopped, but something drew me to the last door on the right, a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and when I pushed it open, I saw an old rocking chair in the corner, swaying gently back and forth. There was no draft, no open windows. I backed out of the room and returned to the living room, chalking it up to the house settling. But sleep didn't come easy after that. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Lights flickered even when the bulbs were new. The smell of mildew intensified. turning into something far more acrid. Like rotting meat, I scrubbed every inch of the place, checked for dead animals in the walls. But the smell persisted. And then there were the flies. They appeared on the second morning, dozens of them, buzzing angrily against the kitchen window. I killed them all. But by the next day, they were back, twice as many as before. It didn't matter how many I swatted or sprayed. They just kept coming. By the end of the week, I wasn't sleeping. Every night, I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, pacing from one end of the house to the other. Sometimes, I heard whispers, low and indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. I started leaving the lights on at night, but it didn't help. The darkness seemed to gather in the corners of the house, pressing in closer with every passing hour. One night, I woke up to find the bedroom door wide open. I was sure I had closed it. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but it was empty. Just as I was about to lie back down, I noticed something on the floor, wet footprints, leading from the doorway to the side of my bed. They stopped inches from where I lay. I spent the rest of the night in my car. I should have left then, but something about the house held me. It wasn't just the money I'd sunk into it. It was like the house didn't want me to leave. And deep down, I didn't want to go. I needed to understand what was happening. The basement had always unnerved me. The stairs were steep and narrow, and the single light bulb cast long, sinister shadows. One night, I finally worked up the courage to go down there. The smell was strongest in the basement, thick and suffocating. I scanned the walls, the floor, looking for anything that might explain the stench. That's when I saw it. A small door in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes. It wasn't on the floor plan. The wood was warped and discolored, as though it had absorbed decades of filth. I pulled it open, and a wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a smell so foul I nearly gagged. The room beyond was small, no bigger than a closet, and the walls were painted a deep, rusty red. At first, I thought it was just old paint, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't paint at all. It was something else, something organic. The walls were smeared with handprints, small and childlike, pressed into the dried substance as though someone had been clawing to get out. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard the laughter, high-pitched and shrill, echoing off the walls of the tiny room. I slammed the door shut and ran up the stairs, my chest heaving. The laughter followed me, growing louder, more frantic. By the time I reached the living room, it had turned into screams. I spent the next few days packing my things. I didn't care about selling the house anymore. I just wanted out. But the house had other plans. Doors that had never locked before refused to open. The windows wouldn't budge. At night, I heard voices whispering my name, taunting me, daring me to leave. The rocking chair upstairs creaked endlessly, even though the room was empty. On my last night in the house, I woke to find myself standing in the kitchen, a knife in my hand. I didn't remember getting out of bed, didn't remember picking up the knife. My reflection in the window didn't look like me. My eyes were wild, my face pale and drawn. Something inside me had changed. The next morning, the front door was unlocked. I didn't question it. I grabbed my bag and walked out, never looking back. I sold the house for a loss a month later. The new owners moved in quickly, a young couple with a baby on the way. I thought about warning them, but what could I say? That the house was alive? That it wanted something from them, just as it had wanted something from me? I still dream about the house sometimes. I see its dark windows staring at me, this front door slightly ajar, as though inviting me back. And in those dreams, I can still hear the laughter, just waiting for me. I know it is,